Hey, what's up everyone? So today we're going to be talking all about the Olympics, specifically the Olympic Games that occurred during the Dark Ages, in between the last Olympic game in Greece in the year 394 AD up until the modern revival in 1896, which is technically the first year of the Olympics, the modern Olympics that we see today. Now, none of these Olympic Games are officially Olympic canon. They don't actually count as Olympic Games. Even though they carry the name of being the Olympics, the competition was not international. So the Olympic Committee does not recognize any of these games as official canon to the Olympics. Now, before we dig into all of these obscure games that took place, let's talk about why the Olympics stopped in the first place in ancient Greece. The original Olympic Games were held in Olympiade, Greece from 776 BC until 394 AD. Now, the 394 date is not 100% known, it's just kind of what historians agree upon, and you'll understand why in a minute. So over this span of over 1,000 years, the Olympics were held every 4 years, and the participants were from all of the different Greek city-states. The original games consisted of chariot racing, foot racing, they also had jumping, discus, javelin throwing, wrestling, boxing. Very similar to what we have nowadays, just a bit watered down from all the various sports that we have now. The ancient Olympics were sort of a hybrid athletic competition mixed with religious ceremony. There was a lot of celebration and tributes to the gods, specifically Zeus and other demigods, Hercules. So the original Olympics was almost sort of a hybrid religious ceremony that was sort of baked into an athletic competition. This is going to make sense in a minute. Now, like I said, it's not entirely known what year the Olympics officially died, but it's believed that the final game was in 394 AD. Now, during this time, Greek influence was kind of on the decline and Roman influence was starting to take over. They were gaining more and more regional power. And in the year 393, there was a Roman emperor named Theodosius I who had put a ban on all pagan rituals across Greece. Now, like I had mentioned before, the Olympic Games were very heavily tied into religion, and the games themselves were a sort of a hybrid religious ceremony. So unfortunately, the Olympics were banned under this new decree. The first attempt to revive the Olympic Games took place in Chipping Campden, England. It was known as the Cotswold Olympic Games. Now, if you're English or Scottish, I'm sure that you've heard of the Cotswold Olympics existing now. However, these are different games than existed back in the 17th century when the Cotswold Olympic Games first came about. It featured a lot of the same events as the Greek Olympics, but it also included sledgehammer throwing, sword fighting, quarterstaff cudgel sparring, shin kicking, which is still a popular sport nowadays. We're going to get into that because it's an interesting one. And then also wrestling, which according to the historical record, low kicks were allowed in this version of the Olympics. So basically you had the shin kicking event where people were kicking each other's legs back and forth, and then you had wrestlers who would be grappling standing up, kicking each other's legs, basically trying to set up a takedown like a modern UFC fight that you would see today. Now, some of these events were downright brutal, and I'm looking at you, shin kicking, but especially like the sword fighting. There is a documented account of someone in the 19th century. One of the sword fighters was actually killed in competition and died right there from his injuries in the stadium. A lot of critics to the Cotswold Olympics described the wrestling and the shin kicking as very brutal and barbaric. The shin kicking involved a couple of competitors, usually wearing steel-toed or spike-tipped boots, kicking each other's shins until the loser gave up in agony. The competitors used to temper their shins by smacking them with hammers to basically cause a bunch of microfractures to strengthen up their legs for the next round of shin kicking. Say whatever you will about shin kicking as a sport, but that is some serious dedication. Now, shin kicking, or low kicks in general, were also allowed in wrestling. And oftentimes, it would be a very common sight to see two wrestlers grappling on their feet while sort of puncturing and bloodying each other's legs with low kicks in these steel-toed boots, which are not the steel-toed boots that you imagine. They're basically leather boots with a steel casing on top. I mean, it's like, just imagine a couple of UFC fighters or judo fighters or something grappling with steel-toed boots, kicking each other in the legs, trying to set up takedowns that way. I mean, we've already seen enough horrifying injuries in the UFC from low kicks specifically, and that's just from people kicking each other barefoot. Like, I couldn't imagine what it would be like to engage in a low kicking contest with steel-toed boots on. Ugh. The games officially ended in 1852, so, you know, they lasted for a couple hundred years, but it happened when the British government began seizing a lot of the common land in Britain, and basically taking this common land and dividing it up among different farmers. So the competition grounds in Campden were seized by the government and partitioned off to private owners. Now, like I said in the sort of the preface to talking about these Dark Age Olympics, the games were local, did not feature international competition. So this revival, you know, technically doesn't count as an official Olympic Games. But, fun fact, and this is probably what a lot of British people, if you're watching this right now, are thinking. In the year 1951, a lot more recently, the Cotswold Olympics were actually brought back to life. However, you know, a lot of the events are a lot different. Obviously, there's a lot more precautions with the sword fighting and whatnot. And the shin kicking is a lot different. It still does exist, but people use padding now, and, you know, they've got like a medic on standby. It's generally a lot safer. However, you're still kicking someone in the shins until they basically cry uncle. All right, and the next attempt to revive the Olympics is a weird one. I really had a very hard time finding any information on this. And any information that I did find, it was all in French, and I had to translate all of it into English to even get an idea of what was going on. I couldn't even find an English account of these games. So there was an attempt during the year 1796 until 1798. So only 3 competitions took place during this time, and it occurred in France during the French Revolution. And fun fact, even though the game started in 1796, its creator, Charles Gilbert Rome, was captured and guillotined for his involvement in the French insurgency. So the guy who is responsible for bringing the Olympics to France, bringing it back to life, was executed before the first game ever even happened. Now, the events were centered around national pride. The French people were very proud and very happy to be hosting an Olympic game, even though, like I said, none of these competitions in this Dark Age are international. But nonetheless, there was a lot of pride in these games. Over 300,000 people showed up to each one of them, so it was wildly popular, very, very talked about during the time. A couple of things to note is that this is the first Olympic competition, believe it or not, where they actually measured things in meters. Prior to this, even the official Olympics in Greece, everything was sort of eyeballed. You had a bunch of judges that determined X, Y, and Z based off of their eyesight. These are the first games to actually measure the scores using time and distance. And it also is the first Olympic Games to feature the parade of athletes that we know and love today that happens in the beginning of the first ceremony. Now, the games ended, obviously, when the French Revolution ended. The French Revolution officially ended in 1799, so 1798 was the last game to be held. Now, one of the major goals of these Olympic Games in France was to really capture the ancient Greek aesthetic, and they had a lot of similar events. It was almost like they knew they were reviving the old games, but knew that they needed a lot more structure and a more measured approach. And like I said, I'm not sure why they're not really talked about in English literature. Like I said, at least I couldn't find anything. There's not even a Wikipedia article on the Olympics that took place during the French Revolution. You'll actually have to go to the French version of Wikipedia and run that entire article through a translator to even read anything on it. And there doesn't even exist that many like artist depictions of the games. I assume after the revolution, records of these games were probably destroyed, but I really have no idea. And the last Dark Age revival that we're going to talk about was another attempted revival that happened in Greece in the year 1859. And these were known as the Zappas Olympics, named after wealthy businessman Evangelist Zappas, who funded these Olympic Games and just had a personal desire to bring the Olympics back. And even though these games were held in the same style as the ancient Greek Olympics and even took place in Greece, it still doesn't count because it didn't feature any kind of international or regional competition. Alright, now we arrive to 1896, which is the first modern Olympic Games since the year 394 AD. It's over 1,500 years since the last Olympic Games. It took place in the birthplace of the Olympics. It was a unanimous decision by the IOC to host the Olympic Games in Athens, Greece. The Greek royal family was extremely excited to host the Olympics, and it was a huge morale boost for the Greek people. What's really cool about the 1896 Olympics is that they were hosted in the Panathenaic Stadium in Greece, which it had existed since the 6th century BC as a race course, and it was later beefed up in the 4th century BC, so a couple hundred years later, when they added in the limestone stadium around the track that we see today. It had been rebuilt and remodeled a few times throughout history, but the original track is almost 2,500 years old by the time of the 1896 Olympics, which is just freaking awesome. Now, Greece was going through some financial strife during this time period, and it looked like the Olympics were not even going to happen. So what the royal family did is they asked the citizens for donations, you know, like, if you guys really want to see these games happen, you know, the people are going to have to make it happen. And surprisingly enough, they raised enough money very quickly. The people were very enthusiastically on board. Soon afterwards, the IOC, the Olympic Committee, had stated that the athletes have to be amateur. But as far as the rules went, it was basically the Wild West. There were no uniform rules, and the rules that were used were chosen from several different athletic associations and oftentimes contradicted each other. The stage was set for a genuine shit show to begin. So the games in 1896 took place between April 6th and April 15th, so 9 days of competition. It featured 14 different countries competing in 43 events. The opening ceremony was performed by King George I of Greece, and the lead referee was actually his son, Prince George. Imagine nowadays, like, the hosting country of the Olympics being the lead referee. There might be a conflict of interest there. Alright, so let's talk about some notable wins from that year. So the Greeks were determined to win the marathon, considering that the first marathon ever was held in Greece from the city of Marathon. And amazingly, the winner of the race was a Greek competitor, but he won the marathon by a massive 7-minute lead over the guy in second place. They were really determined to win. Now, the winner of the 1,200-meter swimming event, Alfred Hajos, said that him and his competitors were taken 1,200 meters into the Bay of Z, where they were forced to swim the distance back to the shore. So they took these guys out by boat over a kilometer away, dropped them off in the middle of the ocean, and said, swim back to shore, good luck. Hajos described the event by saying that his will to live overcame his desire to win. I just can't imagine participating in a sporting event where if you fail, you die. Another thing to note is this is the first year that the Olympic hymn that we know of today was used. However, it was not used subsequently until 1960 when they brought back the original song from 1896, and that's actually the song that we know today. And I just wanted to point out the weightlifting portion of the Olympics is basically like a kettlebell clean and press, like a push press with kettlebells. Very odd event. Pretty cool to see in the Olympics, but you know, nothing like what we have today in terms of weightlifting. All right, so let's talk about some of the notable shit show style things that happened during these Olympics. So first of all, there was no weight classes in wrestling. I don't think I need to say anything past that. Another thing to note is that the competition was held very similar to modern strongman competitions, where you would have one competitor that would compete in multiple different events. So you might have one athlete lifting weights, throwing shot put, doing a run, and then getting chopped off in the middle of the bay and swimming for 1,200 meters back to shore. One of the most notable shit show things to happen during these Olympics is that all of the rowing events were canceled. Why were all the rowing events canceled? Because they didn't order enough boats. I mean, it's just kind of funny, like there weren't enough boats for rowing competition, but there were enough boats to take your ass into the middle of the bay and drop you off over a kilometer from shore. But thankfully, everyone survived. That's pretty much it for the video. I just kind of wanted to do a little deep dive into these obscure Olympic competitions that happen and kind of add a bookend to each side, you know, describe where the Olympics left off, where they picked up again, and what were all of the sort of things that happened in between. So if you like this video, please leave a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed, and if you would like to support me, there's options down in the description for that. I'd really appreciate if you did. Have a good rest of your day, and I will see you in the next video. Peace out.